Our panelists and webinar attendees, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and maybe even good night, depending on where you are. My name is Noel Watson. I'm a supply chain researcher in global health and a member of the organizing committee of the Global Health Supply Chain Summit. I'm also an aspiring entrepreneur in pharma manufacturing for Africa, so I'm particularly excited to be co-moderating this discussion on expanding Africa's vaccine manufacturing network. The current reality of Africa's vaccine supply chain is that almost all the vaccines and related technologies are imported and reliant on external inputs. As of the recent past, local production only existed at a very modest level in Egypt and Tunisia, a limited but visible level in Senegal, and a more promising level in South Africa. Prior to that, the manufacturing scene in Africa was more vibrant, but a number of African vaccine producers have disappeared in the last 30 years, particularly in North Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and other places, driven by a lack of technology, by a lack of technical and regulatory skills, limited capital, and more importantly, lack of long-term strategy to cope with new technologies, GMP and quality assurance requirements, and increasing competition. Our panel on expanding Africa's vaccine manufacturing network will look at the challenges and efforts underway and still needed for supporting this expansion from perspectives including technology access, procurement policy, financing, and manufacturing support. On our panel today, we have Ms. Chema, Triki-Industrial Lead at Tony Blair Institute, Mr. Rajinder, Suri-CEO of the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network, Dr. Stavros, Nicolaou, Senior Executive for Strategic Trade at Aspen Pharmacare, South Africa, Mr. Patrick Tippoo, Executive Director, African Vaccine Manufacturers Initiative, and Head of Science and Innovation at BioVac, South Africa, and Professor Arthur Mutambara, former Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, and currently Executive Director and full Professor, Institute for Future of Knowledge. We have asked our panelists to give us their brief thoughts on the topic of interest from their unique perspectives. And at the end of all their talks, we will open it up for a Q&A through the Q&A mechanism in Zoom. At this moment, I want to hand over to my co-moderator. We've already met Dr. Lloyd Matoe to introduce himself and our first speaker. Lloyd.
Thank you, Noel. I've been introduced already. My name is Lloyd Matoe. I work with an organization called Pharmaceutical Systems Africa and also PICMA Africa Limited. We're a consultants firm focusing on supply chain systems and pharmaceutical systems. I also serve as an academician at a private university in Lusaka, Zambia. Noel has set the scene already of our panel. We have reached panelists. And to begin the discussions today, I introduce to you Professor Arthur Mutambara. Professor Mutambara is a strategy consultant based in Joburg, South Africa. And with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, he has led the development of a number of strategies, including fostering mechanisms for local manufacturing and sustenance on the African continent. When he's not formulating strategies, Professor Mutambara is a known politician and business leader. In fact, during the period the country of Zimbabwe was in turmoil, he formed one of the three principles that led to a government of national unity and stability. He went on to become a deputy prime minister in the Republic of Zimbabwe. So he speaks from a position of authority, but also of strategy and leadership. Prof, I hand you over to the mic with the nuances that would like you first to talk us through why do we continue to face challenges in this day and age. Over to you, Professor Mutambara.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just trying to get my slides up here. Thank you very much for that introduction. How to expand the vaccine manufacturing network on the continent. I'll try to explain and go through what the problems are, and then also proffer some solutions in brief, and then we can have more discussion during the Q&A. But the challenge is, what is the nature of the vaccine manufacturing network on the continent? What are the challenges? What are the potential solutions? What do we want as Africans? We are sick and tired of being recipients of vaccines from the global north. We are sick and tired of being dependent on the goodwill and benevolence of the global north. What we want is African agents. We want to produce our own vaccines on the continent, do our own R&D, do the manufacturing for our own vaccines on the continent, and not be overly dependent on China, dependent on India, dependent on Europe or the United States. That's what we want. Maybe we cannot do it for COVID, but for any future pandemic, we want to be consuming our own vaccines. We want to be generating our own vaccines and distributing them across the continent. That's our vision, putting Africans at the center of the development, manufacturing, and distribution of vaccines. What is the mission? The mission is a strategy by Africans, primarily funded by Africans, developed and manufactured and distributed by Africans. There are enough resources on the continent to do this. What we might lack is technology. The expertise is there. Why don't we partner with Europe, partner with America, partner with China to do the R&D on the continent, to do the manufacturing on the continent? And we as Africans should be in charge of our medical destiny. We are pushing for what we call African Agency in Public Health. Look at the situation right now. As we speak, only 7% of the African continent has received the 2 dosages or 1 for Moderna. In other words, fully vaccinated. We're talking about 7%. About 80% of the Africans have not even received their first dosage. Now Europe is talking about booster shots. Europe and America are talking about booster shots. They are also holding vaccines where they have 6 times their requirement of vaccines. That's what we're saying. We cannot depend on the goodwill of the global north. We must be able to do things on our own. And recently, of course, you know about the bans, this new variant, and how flights have been banned from Southern Africa. And so, because we're not in control, we want to be in control so that we can do our own thing. What are some of the areas? Vaccine R&D and manufacturing. What are some of the issues? Looking at the existing R&D and manufacturing best practices on the continent. There's some work going on the continent. What can we learn from it? How can we leverage that experience on the continent? What are some of the technical issues? As Africans, we must know the technical issues involved in vaccine R&D, involved in vaccine manufacturing. We must have R&D capacity for genome identification on the continent. We must develop infrastructure for clinical trials. These are the problematic areas which are also the solutions. By solving these problems, we also get our solutions to become independent. In terms of manufacturing, we also talk about distribution. We must do advocacy to the political leaders, to the bankers, to the private sector, so that we can have R&D and manufacturing on the continent. We must understand the key requirements and the enablers for research and development, enablers for manufacturing. We must strengthen and harmonize regulatory capacities on the continent. We must build Africa's broad vaccine and R&D capacity. We must move from vaccine R&D to vaccine manufacturing. I know this topic we're saying Africa's manufacturing network. We can't talk about manufacturing without doing R&D. If you manufacture using other people's IP, you go to get permission from them, or you might have to do just fill and finish. Ideally, what we want on the continent is to do R&D and develop our own vaccine. After developing the vaccines, we then go to manufacturing. After manufacturing, we go to distribution. There's a difference between access to vaccines and vaccination. We must be able to move the vaccines from the depots to the people's arms. That distribution must be invested in. That movement of vaccines into the villages, into the towns, must be worked on. So number one, R&D. Number two, manufacturing. Number three, distribution. Effective distribution, cold chains must be developed so that we can get the vaccines into the arms of our people. So effective vaccine rollout across the continent is critical. All these things will require money. So we must have a sense of the levels of investment, the levels of money required, and the financing mechanisms required to do the job. These are the challenges, but these are also the opportunities for us to make a difference. So let us be very clear on the vision. Where do we want to be as an African continent in terms of vaccine manufacturing? What is our strategy to get to that destination? Where is the implementation plan? The implementation matrix. This is the framework in which we should address the challenge on the continent. And forget about national strategies. We want an African vaccine strategy, which then goes down to the regional vaccine strategies. ECOWAS, East African Community, SADC, Maghreb. 1.3 billion Africans working together with a potential GDP of $2.3 trillion. That is the only way we can do R&D on the continent. That is the only way we can manufacture vaccines on the continent when we work as a continent of 1.3 billion Africans with a collective GDP of $2.5 trillion. You can see the money is there. The resources are there. What's missing is the political will. What's missing is the technology for us to do this. And by the way, money is not enough to get vaccines. The African envoy on vaccines, Strive Masiwa, was able to raise billions of dollars, and he went to Europe. Europe, here we come, we're the Africans, we have the money, we want to buy vaccines. And the Europeans were not interested in selling to the African. They're busy stocking these vaccines for their own populations. So having money to buy vaccines is not an answer. Doing R&D is the answer. Doing the manufacturing is the answer. We must have a sense of the scale of the challenge, and we get some insights here from the Africa CDC, okay? We are only producing 1% of our requirement. 99% is imported. We must move that number from 1% to 70% in the next 10 years. It is a travesty of justice that the African is only producing 1% of his or her own needs. In terms of manufacturing capacity, Morocco, Algeria, Dakar, those are the few areas where some action is taking place. It's inadequate. And also, they're all driven by a national strategy. We don't want that. France goes into a deal with Morocco to put a plant. Germany goes to do a deal with Ghana to put a plant. France, through Macron and Sriram, do a plant in South Africa. Unacceptable. We don't want that. We must engage Germany as the African continent. Engage France as the African continent. Engage China as an African continent. We then decide. We have an agreement with France to do a plant in Africa. Our decision is to put the plant in Nigeria or to put the plant in Malawi. The African decision, not a national decision between Ghana and Germany, France and South Africa, Morocco and China. Unacceptable. We need an African strategy where we negotiate as a continent so we can leverage economies of scale, so we can get a better deal when we negotiate. Can you imagine if when you rock up and say, here I come, I'm the African. I speak on behalf of 1.3 billion Africans, and behind me I have a GDP of $2.3 trillion. The Americans will listen to you, not out of love, out of economics. The Chinese will listen to you, not out of love, but out of economics. So scale is the name of the game if we're going to expand the manufacturing network on the continent. Okay? And of course, we have poor distribution networks, poor supply chain management, poor supply management skills. We are focusing on national strategies. We must pool our resources together and be able to work as a continent. We have no confidence. The African doctors, the African pharmacist, the African engineer is not confident of doing research. Is not confident of building. We are servicing, we are maintaining, we are just servicing products from other domains. We need to build confidence in our scientists that they can do R&D, they can do manufacturing. We have a wrong educational system from primary school, secondary school to tertiary education, where we emphasize on service, where we emphasize on maintenance and not on creativity, entrepreneurship, and knowledge creation. We must be able to leverage our partnerships. Another big issue, when we say vaccines, when we say medicines, it's not charity. We must convince our private sector, we must convince our bankers that when you invest in vaccine manufacturing, it's a business. When you say Pfizer, when you say Moderna, they're making tons and tons of money from the manufacture of vaccines. It's not charity. When the Global Fund, WHO and UNESCO, when they buy these vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna are making money. Why can't the African also be part of that financial value chain? It's a business, not charity. So when we invest in manufacturing, in R&D on the continent, we must understand it as a business. We must build the business case and show it to our bankers, show it to our private sector so they can invest in this business, show it to our governments. We lack visionary African leaders, both in the public and private sector. They're caught up on the nation state. That's why you find South Africa cutting a deal with France, Ghana with Germany, Morocco with France, Kenya with China. We must say, I'm an African first, a member of SADC second, and a Zambian third. I'm an African first, a citizen of ECOWAS second, a Nigerian third. This is the psychology we want. We must move away from national sovereignty to embrace continental sovereignty, to embrace the continent. Only continental strategies will allow us to be manufacturers of vaccines. And the key enablers will be advocacy. The key enablers will be building our capacity and harmonization of policy and also IP. We need to campaign for the relaxation of IP rights so that we can manufacture using other people's IP. Before we have our own medicines, we might have to manufacture using other people's IP. Why don't you work with the global authorities so that there is a relaxation on IP rights and we can manufacture on the continent, okay? And then we'll build our capacity. We must leverage existing institutions, AMA, MRH, PMPA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, Africa CD. These are African institutions which we should leverage as we seek to expand the manufacturing network of vaccines on the continent. In summary, as I conclude, this is the framework of what we want to do. What we want equitable and universal access to vaccines and vaccination. Equitable, universal access to vaccines and vaccination. Beyond vaccines to medicines on the continent. Equitable, universal access. What are the key drivers of that access? R&D and manufacturing. What is another pillar? The infrastructure and capacity that you need to roll out. And then, of course, everything falls or rises on finance. A finance ecosystem approach, a regional approach, and a continental integration. This is the framework in which we can expand the vaccine manufacturing network on the continent. We must understand those three pillars, we must understand our vision, but that can be done by a country like Liberia or Nigeria or Zimbabwe or South Africa. This can be done by the continent. This can be done by a region like SADC, East African Community, ECOWAS, or Maghreb. We must think scale, but this is the framework. Okay, what are the conclusions? We must achieve equitable access to vaccines, but we must know there's a difference between vaccine and vaccination. The absorptive capacity. If we give you the vaccines in Zambia, are you able to absorb them? Where is your infrastructure for distribution? Okay. We want to increase Africa's capacity to develop and produce vaccines, and we want it to be able to distribute across the continent. Okay. And in all these things, we must ensure African agents in all matters of public health. If we have no public health security, you have no national security. Health security is national security. By depending on the global north, by depending on China, it means we've no national security in our countries. Let us have agency in terms of public health and leverage our existing institutions as I indicated on. We need a multi-stakeholder ecosystem approach. The private sector, the civic society, the government, and our partners globally, but on our terms. We partner with China on our terms. We partner with Europe on our terms. We partner with America on our terms. We partner with global pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, on our terms. But we can't do it as little countries. We can engage as a continent. We can unlock better economies of scale when we operate as a continent. As I said already, lack of health security is a threat to national security, and more importantly, to continental security. Africa will achieve health security on its own. You know why? Europe does not want us to be manufacturers of vaccines. China does not want us to be manufacturers of vaccines. America does not want us to be manufacturers of vaccines. The same applies to big pharma, global big pharma. Why? Because it's a business. They would rather we remain consumers. They would rather we remain dependent on them. So if we're going to do this, we must understand this. We are going to do it against all odds. Like Biko said, Black man, Black woman, you are on your own. African man, African woman, you are on your own in terms of the agenda of being an R&D continent, or being a manufacturing continent. We will achieve this if we work together as a continent, by knowing very well that it is not in the interest of the global north for us to be a net producer of vaccines. I have a very short period of time, so I'll stop there and we can have more discussions after the other colleagues have spoken. But the summary of it all is that let us think continental, not national. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof, for those powerful and passionate contributions. I think one key take-home message from your presentation, you're asking the question, what haven't Africans done for themselves, rather than what haven't others done for them? I think that those questions are different. So we take a retrospect of us as a person, as a continent, rather than looking elsewhere to blame. I don't think there's anybody to blame if we are not able to do what's required of us. Thank you, Prof. Noel, please, yes, I ask you to introduce the next.
Thank you, Lloyd. And while the panelists are being introduced, they can use that opportunity to put their slides up. Next, we're going to hear from Patrick Tippoo. Patrick is a good friend of mine. He's a founding member of the African Vaccine Manufacturers Initiative, where his passion about breaking Africa's cycle of dependency and reliance on supply of much needed vaccines from outside Africa could be harnessed along with other like-minded individuals across the continent to effect needed change. He currently serves as its executive director and is a strong advocate for the establishment of vaccine manufacturing capacity in Africa. But for his day job, he's the head of science and innovation at BioVac, a South African public-private partnership to manufacture vaccines, initially for the South African market, but then beyond. The responsibilities of BioVac have included product development, strategic alliance partnering, international relations, projects, and business development. Patrick, please take it away.
Thanks, Noel, and thanks for this opportunity to share some perspectives of what's happening across the continent. And as the brief advised, I'll do a very high-level overview of AVMI, the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. I will highlight some progress with respect to what's happening on the Partnership of African Vaccine Manufacturing, and then just share some perspectives with respect to BioVac as a local vaccine manufacturer, and some of the issues that I think are common challenges. So AVMI was established more than 10 years ago to advance the establishment of sustainable human vaccine manufacturing capacity in Africa when it wasn't the flavor of the month. And we foresaw the situation where in an emergency situation like we're experiencing now, vaccine access would be problematic, and therefore we need to have our own capacity. We all have come to rest on this reality now, but it's taken COVID-19 to bring that into focus. So some of the work that we've done over the years in collaboration with many different partners, there's the VMPA study, which focused on vaccine manufacturing and procurement in Africa, which dipped into how vaccines are procured, the market, financing, the technical capabilities. So it was a landscape analysis. Then in partnership with UNIDO, there were 2 white papers authored by Chris Howard, which investigated and analyzed how to identify opportunities within the market for commercial production of vaccine. And then the third document, which is a white paper as well, focused on the essential critical elements. If you're thinking of establishing vaccine production capacity, these are the issues to deal with. And then lastly, we partnered with TIBA to hold a workshop on policy development with respect to Africa, an African vaccine policy. So this was some of the work that we did, but really interesting. 2, 3, 4 years ago now, this VMPA study highlighted some points that we all appreciate now. There's space for regional hubs, there's space for multiple players. It requires political support. It needs a coherent regional approach. And it needs an enabling ecosystem, all things which we've become too familiar with. So transitioning now to what's actually happening today on the continent. And I think that the one thing that has been unprecedented is that we have, for the first time, an African vision with respect to vaccine manufacturing and vaccine development. And I think it's a key to appreciate that it's both. Development and manufacturing capacity needs to be built for reasons that I think we've come to appreciate. This slide was presented before, and it's the aspirational goal that we are collectively pooling our efforts towards, that in 20 years' time, that most of the vaccines on the African continent, used on the African continent, will be made on the African continent. It's important to note that we cannot build this industry focused on COVID vaccines only. We cannot build this industry focused on vaccines for or against pathogens which might generate pandemics into the future, or vaccines that are against pathogens that might be problematic in terms of Africa only. Number 4 is critically important, and that is that a sustainable vaccine industry can only be built on vaccines which are used routinely as part of EPI programs across Africa. And this is critical to appreciate in terms of our efforts of building this capacity. So what is currently taking place on the African continent in the form of the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing? There's this collective effort under the leadership of the African CDC, so it is a continental effort to develop a framework for action. And this framework for action is informed by the work done within the 6 work streams on market design and demand intelligence, absolutely important for sustainability, to reshape this market, to incentivize the investment in local production. I think we all appreciate the need for regulatory strengthening and the milestone achievement of the formation of AMA. Access to finance has been highlighted over and over again. The whole issue of technology capabilities and the related issues of intellectual property is also work that's been done within the framework for action. The focus on R&D and the workforce and talent development is also highlighted. And then lastly, the need for infrastructure development. And so collectively, the work of these work streams have been integrated in what will become known and endorsed by the African Union as the framework for action. So this is remarkable in terms of the level of integrated effort that is currently in progress across the African continent. Just to touch on, so there's this initiative, but what are the products that we need to focus on? Without diving into the detail and analyzing the methodology, 22 diseases have been prioritized, which fall basically into the legacy vaccines or the legacy diseases, that which we need to expand into now, including rotavirus, malaria, HIV, for example, and then the outbreak diseases. That needs to then intersect with the technology platforms, moving from the traditional through to the more innovative mRNA. Now it's common language around the dinner table. So we understand that these vaccine products require different technologies in order to make them. And then also not only to focus on full finish, not only to focus on drug substance and full finish, but to also include R&D. So zooming in then to our experience at BioVac, which I think is probably a common experience that we all have in lower middle income countries in terms of how do we build a sustainable, thriving industry. I highlighted this point before, the need for market access, and in Africa, it's a particular problem because 40 of the 54 countries depend on UNICEF and Gavi for their vaccines, either fully subsidized or partially subsidized. And this presents a huge challenge in terms of the pool of the market to incentivize investment with respect to vaccine R&D and manufacturing. So we need to creatively establish mechanisms that guarantee purchase of locally made vaccines. The whole vaccine procurement needs to be reshaped, redesigned, and there needs to be an appreciation that Prashant Yadav of the Center for Global Development calls it the resilience premium that needs to be paid. These vaccines are not necessarily going to be cheaper initially, but over time it will become cheaper as economies of scale are reached. We need to understand that when we talk about vaccine production and the products, that we need to focus on the full vaccine manufacturing value chain over time. It's a good start to be building it from the formulation full finish side of things, but we need to work backwards across the full vaccine value chain. There needs to be a diversification of products, locations, and technologies across Africa. that needs to be pulled together in some kind of a network fashion, and that includes R&D and product development. I've hinted at the reverse integration strategy and the forward integration strategy as a way of building this capacity. I think there are opportunities where one or other would work well. Technology transfer partnerships are critically important, and BioVac has really benefited from that. And we can't underestimate the investment of time, effort, and money in workforce development. And then partnerships. And these partnerships can only be secured when we build trust and confidence through building a track record. We've got to deliver on our commitments, and that then creates an upward spiral of success. So those are some thoughts and perspectives. Obviously, we can have a deeper dive, which would take hours into each of these topics. But Noel, I'll hand over to you, back to you now, and would be willing to entertain any detailed discussion on any of these issues during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Excellent, Patrick. Thank you so much for that. Lloyd, I'm going to hand over to you so we can keep rolling and you can introduce Stavros.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Patrick. Quite insightful. Our next speaker is Dr. Stavros Nicolaou. He is the Aspen Pharmacare Group Senior Executive responsible for strategy, trade, and development. For most of us who are based here in Africa, thank you. It's good to see you, Dr. Stavros. We know Aspen. They are the biggest pharmaceutical manufacturer on the continent. And these past few days, 3 days or so, we all woke up to a fanfare in the news, Aspen, and potential to partner. Maybe it's signed already. We'll hear from Dr. Stavros if it's if it is public information. But we've relied on them in pharmaceuticals, and we continue to look up to Aspen to lead on the continent. Dr. Stavros comes to this panel and in his position with over 30 years experience in the pharma industry. And he is a previous winner of the South Africa Institute of Marketing Management Award, a prestigious award in the country. Dr. Stavros, please have the mic.
Lloyd, Noel, fellow esteemed colleagues and panelists, it's indeed a great pleasure for me to, in the first instance, participate in this panel. It's a critical discussion. It's not a new discussion, of course, as Professor Mutambara indicated earlier. It's a fairly old discussion, but one that we seem to be making very little progress in, but one that I'm detecting over the last 20 months or so, a renewed interest. And I think a little more than a renewed interest, I'm actually starting to see Africa organizing itself, galvanizing itself. And I think we are starting to see some of what was previously a lot of talk and a lot of policies. I'm starting to see some tangible movement in the right direction. So that's been very encouraging for me. There have been many, many learnings in this during this pandemic. And for me, the most significant learning of all has been that local capacities solve local problems. So without local capacities, you can forget about making any dent in any public health challenge on the continent. We've seen this repeatedly, and I should also just re-preface what the professor was saying. I've known him for some time. He's actually a nuclear physicist, right? But he spoke today as a person with a very practical approach to how we solve the problem. Very often they say nuclear physicists aren't practical, but I think he's certainly backing the trend here today. So can I say that the biggest learning, of course, on these local capacities then poses the next question, which is, well, if we clear that Africa's only received, and the numbers vary, but we received about 5% of the global COVID vaccine supplies. So clearly there's gross inequality and an even distribution of COVID vaccines. As the professor correctly pointed out, many countries are onto boosters. We haven't even administered a single shot to 5% of the population on the continent. So this gross inequality continues, and the question gets posed, well, how do we best and most rapidly solve the problem? And I think for us, and I'm taking very much an Aspen approach, this is how we looked at this. And I just want to retrace a couple of the steps that we took early on last year, with the hope that what that does is it gives some type of semblance and a type of a journey that one can follow, with the end game being that you develop these local capacities on the continent. Now, I think in saying all of this, I also acknowledge where the strengths and weaknesses of the continent lie. R&D is certainly not a strength of ours. It's something that we can aspire to in future. And I think you've got to start with where your strengths lie first, and then you build up. Now, India did this around 40 years ago. So India were in a position where they had pervasive and abject poverty in the country. They couldn't access capital. They were educating people but couldn't get them into employable positions. So they were faced with a real set of obstacles that required them to think laterally as to how they could solve it. And what they did is they said, look, we've got skills. That's a strength of ours. We don't have capital yet. But how do we harness these skills to get to a position over a period of time where eventually you move up the R&D value chain? And that's exactly what they did. So this thing of India didn't happen by accident. It was a cohesive strategy, and one where you stick and stay the course. And they did this over a 40-year period. And now we know that they are not just cheap manufacturers, but also are doing R&D. Now, we need a similar approach on the continent. So there's always a starting point. So let me try and trace in practical terms how Aspen looked at this. Aspen is a 24-year-old business. We're a fairly young business. We started off with no intentions of any global footprint, and not even a continental footprint. We were going to be focused pretty much on consumer branded pharmaceutical products. Anyway, one thing led to another. I don't have the time to go through all of that, but it's a very interesting case study one day if you want to look at it. We got into manufacturing, and everyone said to us, you must shut down your manufacturing, rather toll manufacture out of India. And the more we looked at this, we said, well, manufacturing can be used as a significant differentiator, both in South Africa, on the continent, and more broadly. And we stuck with that philosophy against the odds. I remember share prices tumbling, and many detractors and doomsayers saying you'll never pull it off. And these guys have lost their way, the management team, and maybe we should even replace them. But we stuck to our guns, and I think it's paid off long term. So we also had a strategy to move up the value chain. So we started doing tablets and capsules, which is compression, compounding and compression. And then we moved up, and eventually we had built a global footprint through acquiring various assets. But in parallel, we kept improving our manufacturing capabilities. And we got into sterile manufacturing. It's an area we invested in heavily. Again, the market criticized us and said, well, what are you going to do? How will you compete? Will you get this right? Do you have the skills? All of these questions keep coming up, right? And again, we stuck to our objectives. We stuck to our guns. And we developed this sterile capability. It's in a town called Quebec in the Eastern Cape. formerly Port Elizabeth. And that is, we own 26 factories around the world, including in Europe and all the continents we own factories. But this plant in Gqeberha is our flagship facility. And we invested in sterile so that we could bring back the manufacture of general anesthetics. Now, Aspen is the largest manufacturer of general anesthetics in the world outside of the United States. So let me deal, Lloyd and Noel, with one myth, that Africa can't do it and Africa can't deliver. So it's not bad to be number one in the world in general anesthetics. Everyone on this call knows they're not easy products. They sterile emulsions. They're not easy products to manufacture. And I'll tell you one other thing, and I'm not saying this, Lloyd, with any arrogance whatsoever or being insensitive to any patient. But during the first wave in Europe, which was January and February of last year, 2020, you'll remember that we saw all these harrowing visuals of Italian and Spanish and French patients dying in corridors and in car parks, etc., because they couldn't get ventilated. So at that time, we were getting phone calls from heads of state, picking up the phone and saying, Aspen, please, can you help us? It's Prime Minister of Italy, the Prime Minister of France, picking the phone up. Now, usually it's the other way around. Usually it's us for Africans picking up the phone and begging for stock to come out of Europe or wherever it is, or India. Okay, now, the tables were reversed. I'm not saying this to be arrogant or to be insensitive to people that are being ventilated. I'm merely illustrating a single important point, which is we ourselves need to shed Afro-pessimism. Very often we doubt our very own capabilities. So I've just given you an example of how we are the number one supplier for general anesthetics in the world and how we were able to supply products to Europe at their time of need. Now, let me fast track to where we are today because I need to start winding down what I'm saying. But because we had this capacity, last March, we had a look at this capacity and we said, well, this pandemic's not going away anytime soon. It's probably going to be longer lasting than we anticipated. We're probably in for a 2 to 3 year period. So how else can we as Aspen, on the tip of the African continent with sterile capacity, how can we assist? And one thing led to another. And we said we can allocate part of our capacity, in fact, 300 million doses of capacity to do fill and finish of vaccines, which is what we did. We signed an agreement with to contract manufacture with Johnson & Johnson. We're the only company in the Southern Hemisphere and on the African continent that entered into such an arrangement with Johnson & Johnson. Of course, Johnson & Johnson is the preferred or one of the preferred vaccine options for the continent. Now, it takes a lot of trust and confidence from these companies because Johnson & Johnson, like many of the others, these are massive companies. To put them in perspective, J&J's market capitalization is 1.5 times the size of South Africa's GDP. And as you know, South Africa's got the second or third largest GDP on the continent, 31st largest in the world. So these are big companies and they require immense trust and track record when they partner with you. Now, we've also demonstrated that again, that Africa can pull off these things. It's a vote of confidence in our scientific and our technical capabilities that we were able to secure this. Now, let me make my final point, Lloyd, which is what you asked me right up front. And that is, as Professor Mutambara said, you can't just stop at fill and finish. You've got to keep evolving. And otherwise, we're never going to dent this import bias that continues to disfigure the continent. And I'm not using the word lightly because we keep industrializing it. To quote Stavros Masiyiwa, one of the best things he said in recent times, and he said many important things lately, but he said, we as Africans are consolidating our volumes on the continent, aggregating them, and then just outsourcing them to someone else in India, who then industrializes, creates the jobs there, gets all the taxes and retains the taxes, enjoys the economic added value, And all they do is they ship the product down to us, and we just keep industrializing and remain poor. So he said, he said to me, Stavros, that's the most counterintuitive thing I've ever heard in my life. Okay, and he comes from a mobile phone industry, etc. He said, I just can't get you guys. I don't understand you guys. Well, what are you thinking? Now that needs to change. And the way we're going to change it is following models like the one I'm describing, the Aspen model. It's not the only model. So let me end off then by saying what we've done recently, because we acknowledge that contract manufacturing is just one step. Okay, you don't control the product where it gets allocated or distributed to as a contract manufacturer. You need to own your own vaccine. So we announced last Tuesday, in fact, a term sheet agreement was reached with Johnson & Johnson for them to license their intellectual property to us. So we will now own the rights to the intellectual property. This is a significant game changer on the continent. It's going to dent that 99% import bill that we continue to afflict the continent with. And it will allow us to produce our own vaccine under our own brand label. It's called Aspen-Vax. And we will have this product in market next year. And of course, it will start backing the trend and breaking the trend that we have for so long as Africans been tolerating. We cannot tolerate it any longer, as Professor Mutambara said. Now, it took understanding your strengths, and one of our strengths is these multinational relationships. And here I must commend Johnson & Johnson, because they have demonstrated, they're one of the few that have demonstrated a need to build capacity on the continent. Ultimately, to conclude, where do we want to go with this? We want to potentially look to diversify our vaccine pipeline if we can. This is a starting point for us. But more importantly, we've got to turn this continent from being a serial exporter of jobs into a continent that exports product and keeps its industrial capacity in the continent. We can only do that if we work together and aggregate all our volumes, as Strive Masiyiwa and the Avid team are currently looking to do. So, colleagues, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. I could have spoken for a lot longer. We're very excited by these developments. They are game changers. They're monumental for the continent. And may there be many more examples, and may we, by a reasonable period of time, stop exporting jobs, keep the jobs here, and start supplying our own people with our own product produced with our own hands and our own machines on the continent. Local capacity solves local problems. Thanks very much.
Stavros, each time I listen to you, I want to listen more. The story of Aspen is compelling. And the few minutes that we gave you, it's been all case studies. So it's a compelling story. And to listen to both you and Prof. Mutambara say we, the strategy is we, the challenges are ours, the framework is ours. It's probably the beginning of the change that we've waited for. We've heard so much about they and what they have not done and what happened 60 years ago. We didn't exist 60 years ago. So it is a compelling story. And we thank you for those contributions. Noel?
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stavros. And you'll be the keynote speaker tomorrow as well. So folks can please turn in tomorrow to hear Stavros speak some more about these issues. Next, we're going to go to Rajinder Suri, who is the CEO of the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network. This network is a voluntary alliance of 41 vaccine manufacturers from 14 developing countries firmly engaged in research, development, manufacturing, and the supply of high-quality vaccines that are accessible to protect people against known and emerging infectious diseases globally. Mr. Suri, hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noel, and thank you for this kind introduction. I would, first of all, like to thank my previous speakers who have really put their heart and soul into the presentations and brought an inside-out view. So what I would like to do is to bring an outside-in view into Africa and try to do justice to Africa's vaccine manufacturing expansion within Africa for Africa. So basically, I must also thank Professor Mutambara, who has given such a passionate presentation and debated and discussed almost everything that I am going to share. So as if we are echoing each other's thoughts without even talking to each other, without even knowing each other. So this is a population of 1.38 billion, which is equivalent to almost 17% of global population, with a GDP of $2.5 trillion and growing at a rate of 3.4%. However, at the other side, we have 9.4 million children, which is 50% of the global number, who are still under-immunized or under-vaccinated. And then vaccine requirement is over 1 billion doses, which is largely catered by Gavi. And it is likely to go up to more than 1.5 billion doses in the next few years. All my colleagues have spoken that the current local production is less than 1%, and the dependence is over 99% on imports. All these challenges have been communicated very effectively, very passionately. But I think what I'm giving you as an external view to that what we feel is happening in Africa. And I think the biggest challenge, which was so far coming up, was a political will and a regional convergence. And then lack of an umbrella leadership and governance. Of course, the mapping needed to be done for both needs and wants, and the prioritization has to be done of what is to be made and what is to be imported. Further, the sustainable funding has been coming up in almost every discussion. And I must emphasize here that COVID-19 has brought two words to the globe. One is collaboration and the other is Africa. So I think this is very important here, that we are all converging to make Africa self-sufficient in vaccines in the coming years. And for this, an establishment of a supply chain mechanism is essential. We need to identify gaps and fill them. And of course, there is no second thought that we have to ensure that the tech transfers are organized. And these are not just the tech transfers, but it's the know-how which is shared. And we start not only manufacturing, but innovation within Africa with R&D and regulatory mechanisms in place. Of course, there is no second thought that what is really required is a human capital investment, both in terms of mapping, training, management, and organizational development strategies. And all this needs to be done at the ground level with realistic action plans. So if we try to look at the present situation, the total African market contributes around $1.6 billion, which is 4% of the global market by value. However, it is 25% of global volume, with top 5 countries contributing almost half of the market value. India has been contributing, and India's name has been coming several times, almost 70% of the volume and 30% of value, while MNCs add 25% of value, but more than 60 to 70% of the value. So the market for vaccines in Africa is expected to grow exponentially in the next decade, reaching almost $5 billion by 2030. And the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly brought out the vaccine inequity and regional disparity, which is highlighting the need of self-sufficiency in domestic production, and that will change dramatically the market share. And again, Professor Mutambara very rightly said that it is not just the immunization gap, but the question is of regional and national security which is, I think, the topmost agenda to be addressed. So how the supply chain mechanism works, I think it's a very simple, input. You have the process, and then you have the output, which is, of course, led by certain governance and the ecosystem which has to be in place. But what is most important is the overall political umbrella and the will which leads to the regional convergence. If we try to look at this supply chain management little more holistically, you will see that the inputs are starting with what is being talked about continuously and emphatically is the R&D capability, the infrastructure, the facilities, and of course the inputs which have been drastically in short supply in the last 1.5 to 2 years. And then of course the most critical part is the people part, which is the competencies of the people and the training of the people, which is going to be utmost important. It is basically going to lead us to the production, which again you have drug substance. So if you are doing only fill finish, probably this is half the value chain. So the drug substance and the drug product both need to be manufactured, which have to be continuously under quality management system and under regulatory governance. So the final product, you have the vaccine in a finished formulation, and then again the distribution, and the Honorable Minister was very emphatic on this part, that it is the distribution. Ultimately the vaccine has to be given into the arms of the people. So how does it reach, and within the cold chain, that it is ultimately reaching the end users. And there are more than 150 to 200 steps in manufacturing of these vaccines, which need to be quality controlled throughout the chain. At the same time, I think there is a very important progress that has been made at a very rapid pace, because I recall in April 2021 that Africa CDC initiated PAVM led by UNECA and supported by FCDO, which has taken giant steps in the last few months, and we have seen the progress. I have been part of one of the working streams within PAVM, and we have seen how progressively the whole continent has moved together as one unit. And the last 2 days we have been witnessing various contributions coming from His Excellencies, the presidents, the ministers, and also the scientists of the highest order, as also the global agencies. So I think what is important is that the political commitment is very much visible now. The high-level strategic direction is already in place in terms of AU and Africa CDC, with AMA now in place. There is a phased program to achieve the goal of 60% production in Africa by 2040, which honestly, I personally feel is realistic, is achievable. I have been in the industry for more than 40 years, and Dr. Stavros just talked about India 40 years back. So I have been a witness to how things have moved and changed, and I can share with you that 25 years back, we were told that India cannot produce hip vaccine, and this is a fact. So within 5 years, we not only produced hip vaccine, but today probably India is contributing to more than 60% of the pentavalent sales all over the world to UN agencies, and other than, of course, meeting 70% of Africa market. So what is important is that you decide, you set a goal for yourself, and then you move in that right direction with the right impetus, and you can achieve those goals. So I think the overall demand and supply position is already being finalized, and you just heard about the Pfizer and BioVac, as well as J&J with Aspen, and BioNTech tying up with Rwanda and Senegal. These are very, very important milestones to make sure that the production, which was a bottleneck, would no more be a challenge. And Moderna is on record to say that they are going to put up a facility of $500 million. But I heard Professor Mutambara that it has to be Africa vaccine manufacturers rather than other companies. So I think even this setting up of mRNA hub is going to, by WHO and COVAX partners in South Africa, is going to play a big role. So over 300 partnerships have been made in COVID over the last 1.5 years, and more than 50 collaborations have been made only in the developing countries. So, I think what is more important and of high priority is the availability, affordability, and accessibility of vaccines to everyone that counts. Now, if you take at this South-South collaboration, I think you can see very clearly that it is Sinovac, which has tied up with Vaxira Egypt, Butantan, PT Biopharma, and in Indonesia, and Pharmacare in Malaysia, whereas Sinopharm with Morocco, with Indonesia and Dubai, and Serum Institute of India has a strong collaboration with Vaxira for several vaccines, and Bharat Biotech within India has tied up with the Indian Immunologicals. Apart from this, these two hubs which have been set up, one by the WHO mRNA hub for South Africa in collaboration with BioVac, Afrigen, and Africa CDC, the PAHO mRNA hub with Fiocruz and Synergium. So I think what is important now is to make sure that we get this assessment of R&D manufacturing capabilities, including labs, facilities, and people, down to the grassroots level. We have a detailed supply chain assessment to be made, the talent management and organizational development to be put in place, sustained funding mechanisms, agreements within governments of all countries, so that there is a total transparency and clarity of what is to be done. And then product portfolio, Patrick touched about that the 22 diseases have been already identified. And what can DCVMN contribute to all this, along with the global agencies like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, SAPI, and PATH? I think what we can do at a micro level assessment of R&D and manufacturing capabilities, including facilities in 11 countries to be done professionally, the talent mapping and developing need gap analysis, because we understand, we speak the same language, we have experienced the same issues, the same challenges. So we can really feel what is required to be done within a developing country or a continent. And organizing these training programs based on experiential learning that we have gone through. And then, of course, organizing technology transfers and exchange of know-how within developing countries, deploying platform technologies. So this is what I think all of us need to do together to make sure that we manufacture in Africa, for Africa, by Africa. Thank you very much.
Noel?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Suri, for that excellent breakdown in connection to the other vaccine manufacturers globally who are operating in similar conditions as in Africa. Lloyd, I'm going to hand over to you. I think we're going to go over the time, and I think that's going to be okay. We're going to have Chema Triki speak, and then maybe 5 minutes for questions. Lloyd?
Yes, we recognize there are questions for Q&A. We'll let Chema speak, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So last but not least of our panelists today is Chema Triki, who is currently the industrial lead at the Tony Blair Institute, where she focuses on economic transformation and private sector development in Africa, with the interface with private sector, really important for this panel. Prior to this, she was at the Institute as an embedded advisor, working with the Ethiopian government on job creation. And before this very important, interesting assignments, she has also worked for several years in management consulting. Chema?
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the panelists for very interesting remarks. I'll try to keep it short because so much has been said. So I'll try my best to add value to what my colleagues on the panel have mentioned. So I'm Chema Triki. I work as an industrialization lead within the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. We actually support 16 African countries on their in delivering their promises, delivering their economic transformation for citizens, and including on developing the vaccine manufacturing, pharma industry, and other sectors that we focus on in Africa. We are currently supporting the governments of Senegal and Rwanda on this on vaccine manufacturing. So much has been said already. So as I said, I'll try to add value, but so the African Union has put this a really important objective and vision of producing 60% of vaccines demanded by the continent by 2040, which the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing has identified that this requires about $30 billion of investment over the next 20 years, so from now until 2040, to finance the implementation of all the pillars of this strategy that has been announced yesterday and today in Kigali, and several discussions were ongoing on that. The majority of this financing would be required for R&D, so for research and development, including for setting up R&D pilot plan, setting up an R&D coordinating platform, and investment in future vaccines development, which is really important, as some of my other panelists have mentioned. It's not only about vaccine development with a fill and finish focus or even drug substance, but it's really about building our capacity in the continent to have the vaccine development. And I say our capacity, I'm from Tunisia, so I consider myself very much as an African. In terms of challenges, the finance, obviously having those $30 billion of investment will be a challenge. However, in the short run, actually there is a consequent amount of money that has been announced or committed by donors. We estimate about 1.6 billion investment or commitment from different donors to support the vaccine manufacturing agenda. And this includes a wide range of donors from DFIs, including focusing on the business case, on financing manufacturers like the syndicated loan the DFC and others have provided to Aspen, but also other donors focusing on different aspects of the ecosystem building, including Mastercard Foundation on the skill development and human capital, which is absolutely key for this agenda. There are four critical challenges that I see for this agenda for the vaccine manufacturing. The first one is, and this has been presented by some of my colleagues, producing a diversity of vaccines that can meet the needs of the continent. Obviously, there are an increasing number of very promising initiatives, and I really congratulate BioVac and Aspen on the huge advancement and huge commitment that they've got, and the initiatives that they are working on. There are also important initiatives in Senegal, Rwanda, with BioNTech announcing a drug substance manufacturing, mRNA manufacturing facility to be set up in Rwanda and Senegal by mid-2022, and as well Ghana and other countries. However, most of these initiatives, we see that they are really focused on the mRNA COVID-19. There is a need really for diversification of the vaccines that will be produced in the continent, with the complementarity between what different countries are producing. So we all agree that this is, that not every country can produce vaccines. There is a need for a sustainable and economically viable agenda, even if we recognize, I think everyone recognizes that this is much more a resilience, health, and political agenda rather than a market-driven one. But a very important resilience agenda for the continent that we absolutely need as African. The second The second challenge that I see is about really building the ecosystem. And not only when we talk about vaccine manufacturing, it's not only about the vaccine making only, whether fill and finish or drug substance, but it's also about the inputs that are required for these vaccines. Where are they coming from? And if we, and that's, I think, an important thing to focus on, which is developing a regional value chain for the vaccine manufacturing, which can be facilitated by the AFCFTA, which entered actually since beginning of this year into force. So that is something that will hopefully help the intra-African trade and help building a regional value chain for across different countries. And now there is, every country kind of want to produce the vaccines, but maybe countries that are not shortlisted or that are not really ready can focus on producing vials, syringes, or other inputs that maybe bioreactors, even if it's a bit technologically advanced. But we need to think about how to make this really a regional value chain that the continent can depend on in case of new pandemic, in case of new supply chain disruptions like the one we are experiencing today across many sectors. We need to build our resilience on the continent to be able to produce sustainably the vaccine without dependency on other regions. And there is a good initiative, I think, from the African Development Bank that has recently adopted a strategy for the pharmaceutical industry, which includes a vaccine that goes beyond. There are put in $3 billion of investment within the next few years, $1 billion in manufacturing and $2 billion in logistics. And this is a very important point. So outside building a regional value chain, having the inputs being produced in different countries, but also building our capacity to trade among each other. We know that intra-African trade is very low, and it's very regional. So COMESA countries will trade within COMESA. ECOWAS countries will trade within ECOWAS, but the North and the East do not necessarily trade among each other. And so having this focus really on building the logistics and the infrastructure is going to be really important, including for the mRNA technology that requires a heavy investment in the cold chain and the logistics to be able to function. The third challenge, or the third thing that is really important, is the building a functioning pooled procurement mechanism. Yesterday, the PAVM, so the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, has announced that they will be building an African pooled procurement mechanism building on the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust, which will ensure the demand certainty, which we know is very critical for this agenda, but as well as functioning and a functioning and coherent regulatory approaches. And the African Medicines Agency has came into force last month. So that's a great advancement, but obviously there is a need for this to work comprehensively across the continent and to have the same, regulatory approaches and the same standards and certification in all the continent. And the fourth point, and I'll stop here as I promised not to take long, as so much has been said, that it is about developing a sustainable economy. And here this is a typical problem that we see in kind of FDI-led industry development, right? That you bring the FDI, you bring the technology, but the domestic linkage and basically the spillover effect on the economy does not necessarily happen. And the binding constraint for that, the government can put all the incentives that they can, they try, but the binding constraint to that is really the investment in skills and R&D. As long as you don't have the talent, as long as we are not able as African to keep our talent within the continent, we will not have a sustainable vaccine manufacturing industry and to go further, pharmaceutical industry. So how to develop, we know that the skills exist in the continent. There are many very good universities that produce engineers, biochemical engineers, biotech engineers, who can help us develop this, but most of them do not have avenues to be able to do a career on the continent. And this is what we need to work on very closely on the long term, and this is a long-term, obviously, objective. To conclude, I think we have, I want to again congratulate everyone who is involved on the vaccine manufacturing in the continent, because so much has been done in just 1 year or 9 months. a year and a half ago, no one would have believed that, Africa can produce vaccines. Today, it's clearly there, and we're making a huge advancement. So I want us to recognize that and to take a moment to really congratulate everyone who has been involved, but also to send the message that we should not only be content with shiny titles and with shiny messages, and that we need to work on the nitty-gritty, on the details to make a sustainable ecosystem for our continent. I'll stop here and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Chema. Very insightful. I took two key points I took from your contribution. Number one, you clearly state this manufacturing and products availability should only be made on sentimentalities, should not be just sentiments, should be business. And Prof. Mutambara did say that too, and we're listening. And the second point you made is on skills and capacity and skills development. So Noel, before I hand over to you to complete, as a follow-up to the capacity question, Professor Mutambara, allow me to ask this question. Any one of the panelists could, but I'm picking on Prof. Mutambara, Oxford trained, nuclear physicist in the United States, now back in Africa, where it all started. The number of questions on the Q&A, the issue of brain. How do we make more of you come back to Africa? And if they do come back, how do we keep them? Thanks, Prof. Very briefly.
The starting point is to acknowledge that we have Africans working at Pfizer, at MIT, at Moderna, who are global best practice, who are as good as it gets. So as African governments, we must have the political will, we must have the self-confidence, we must have the right diaspora policies to attract those Africans to come to the continent. And those experts as well must also have Africa on their minds. You'll never be respected as an African until Africa has done well as a continent. You could be at MIT, at the World Bank, at Pfizer, you're still an African, and they'll judge you by the success or lack of it of the continent. So these experts must take it personally and come to the continent. But more importantly, we must make sure that we are clear that we're not asking for charity. When the expert comes to Africa, they will make as much money, if not more, than they were making in Europe and in America. How so? We must incentivize the private sector, the private banks, the entrepreneurs on the continent to invest in manufacturing, to invest in R&D, not for charity, but for economics. And by the way, the emphasis must be on African money, African private sector, not donors and foreign investors. He or she who pays the piper calls the tune. With $2.5 trillion collective GDP, surely we have enough resources on the continent to invest in these things. But finally, on the issue of the diaspora, why don't you learn from others? India has done it, China has done it, Israel has done it. How have they managed to attract and leverage their technical experts who are globally placed? So we as Africans can learn from China, learn from India, learn from Israel as we pursue this agenda. But more importantly, political will, self-belief, and self-confidence.
Thank you, Prof. Noel, I'll hand over to you.
Excellent. And I'll just pose one more question, and I'll direct it to Stavros and Patrick. You know, Stavros, you described sort of a reaction to a strategy to manufacture in Africa, as folks saying, don't do it, it won't work, we're going to punish you, we're going to punish your share price. And it relates to a question that was asked, have the incentives been changed within Africa, where if an entrepreneur or another company were to decide to pursue a manufacturing strategy in Africa, that the reaction would be different? Would there be support from, you know, for their share price and so forth for them to do that? Have things changed enough so that the reaction would be different, or is there still more work to do?
Noel, you've asked me an extremely complex question, which I would need some time to answer. and we don't have that time today. So I'm going to give you the brief version, and I'm going to pick up on this tomorrow when I give the keynote address. So that's the commitment I'll make. I think in very simple terms, and I'm going to segue from Arthur's earlier response. The very first thing we've got to do on this continent is we have to start walking the talk. And walking the talk means there's not a year that doesn't go by where every January you pick up a new African pharmaceutical production plan or program or the likes thereof. And these are great plans, but we never implement them. That's the problem. So like Arthur says, who's going to take us seriously when you don't implement these plans? Eventually investors are going to say, well, you on paper creating you're creating an environment to go and attract investors, but you're actually chasing them away because you're not implementing chapter 1 of the plan, let alone going through to chapter 30, right? So the very first thing we've got to do is we have to hold our governments on the continent accountable, because they are usually the ones that create this enabling environment. So they will say, we want to localize. Okay, and then next month when you go and visit the medical stores, what happens? You see these crates of imported product, and you say, but for goodness sake, this is the policy of the government, it's localization. I'll give you an example here in South Africa. We are by far the world's biggest consumers of antiretrovirals. We have 17% of the world's HIV-infected population, yet we are importing 70% of the world's 70% of the requirements from India. Now, how can that be? And I'll tell you what, front and center of South Africa's COVID reconstruction and recovery plan is localization. So when you go to the health department and you point this out, their response is, no, but it's not our mandate. Well, I'm afraid it's every single African's mandate to localize, whether you're in the private or the public sector. But more importantly, is if we've got these policies, we've got to make sure that there's accountability and transparency in implementing those policies. And if they are not implemented, people need to be held accountable, because all they're doing is they're just growing year on year the import bill of the continent. They're deindustrializing and unemploying more and more people every year. So that's the starting point for me, is we've got to walk the talk and implement the policy. Starting point. Then you can start doing all the things that Arthur's talking about, bringing in African graduates and postgraduates, etc. Right now, why would they come into a deindustrialized environment? Not one of them will come. So that's the first and starting point for me. And I'm sorry, I do have to drop off, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stavros. Bye. Patrick, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, there's not much to add to what Stavros has said. I think he's hit all the headline points. But I think in summary, there's still a lot to do. We are at the beginning of this journey. I don't think we should fool ourselves that we've got a distance to go. But I think we should encourage ourselves that hopefully this will be a good start. Where we're having these conversations almost on a daily basis, but it comes down to political commitment, because it is the political commitment that control it, etc. So unless we have demonstrated evidence of that happening, I think sadly all of this could come to naught over the next couple of years if as Stavros says, the policy is not turned into proactive actions.
Well put. So we've gone way over time, but I think the conversation was worth it. I want to say special thanks to our panelists, Patrick Tippoo, Chema Triki, Professor Mutambara, Stavros, who left, and Rajinder. Thank you so much for your comments, your time, for preparing for this. Maybe I'll just have Ravi, if you could quickly also just provide a thanks from the organizing committee for our panelists, and we'll end here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Noel. Obviously, this is a very important and engaging and passionate topic for everybody, and you can see that come through in the discussion. I wish we had more time, but that's a good way to end a panel where attendees hunger for more, right? That's what I tell us, right? So thank you so much again, distinguished panelists, for taking time off your busy schedule. I know there are competing events going on, but at least that makes that tells us that this is an important, timely issue that needs to be addressed on multiple forums, and it's a very long journey. I think at least great to hear that there is people are coalescing around starting this journey, so appreciate that. And thank you, Noel, and thank you, Lloyd, for your deft moderation of this panel. I know we ran over, but hopefully attendees got important insights. So we will close this session now, and I know we have 10 minutes only before we start the parallel tracks. So this is to attendees. We move into parallel tracks at 11:45, which is 10 minutes from now. We will log off, close this, and you use the feed loop platform to join in on the parallel tracks at 11:45. Meanwhile, I encourage you to still, even though it's only 10 minutes, go to the networking session and at least visit there and meet some people and maybe have a conversation with some of the poster presenters. You will have another opportunity towards the end of the day today to go back to networking session. But thank you again, panelists. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Good evening and good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.